At the core of what the Aspen Institute stands for is taking people from different backgrounds, different ideological viewpoints of different parties, and bringing them together for civil discourse and to find common ground. I think it's there's no better emblem of that than the fact that our board of directors now has, with all due respect to Warren Christopher, the two most interesting former secretaries of state that I can imagine, and two of my favorite people who really do embody the concept of leadership based on values, and also the notion that people who do lead based on values can have civil discourse and find common ground on the problems facing us. Another person who does embody that is Nick Burns. Nick Burns is the the director of the Aspen Strategy Group, one of our oldest policy programs run by Joe Nye and Brent Scowcroft. There's a wonderful picture, if I remember correctly, in the Koch building of Condi Rice 20 years ago or so when you first... 22 years ago. This is after she was at the music festival and decided that she should do foreign policy instead. Sitting next to Joe Nye. You haven't changed. And Joe didn't even have any more hair back then. There's Joe. Stand up. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. But the two of them are standing there. And so it's great to have you back with us again. Nick Burns runs the Aspen Strategy Group, and in the spirit of bipartisanship was an Undersecretary of State and spokesman for Madeleine Albright, and then the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Undersecretary Condi Rice. So thank you very much, Nick, and thanks for handling this.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Aspen Institute. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us. The first thing I want to do is salute Walter Isaacson. He's America's original Renaissance man. Not only has he rejuvenated the Aspen Institute, he's a member of the Harvard Board of Overseers, chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and probably right now our most celebrated biographer. So Walter, thank you for everything you're doing. As we start, I also want to salute two other individuals. They're seated in the front row. They're the reason why Condi, Madeleine, and I are here today with you. General Brent Scowcroft and Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard University. They founded the Aspen Strategy Group about 30 years ago, and a lot of us have been coming for years to discuss foreign policy issues, always in private, and so we thought this year, Walter and I thought, that we might have a public session where we deal and discuss some of the leading international challenges facing the United States, and it's because of Brent and Joe that we're here. And normally, we would have this private discussion, we'll begin tomorrow morning, right here at Aspen, but today we're going to have a discussion with two very distinguished public servants and leaders, Condi Rice and Madeleine Albright. The format's going to be very simple. For the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to ask them a series of very simple and straightforward questions. Then we're going to open up the microphones. We'll be able to call on people, and we'll be out of here by 5:30. These two women really don't require much of an introduction. They're so well known to all of you. But we were talking the other night, Madeleine and I, and we discovered that there are a lot of similarities between them. Both of them had to overcome, as young people, quite significant obstacles before they could even dream of being Secretary of State one day. I think most of you know Madeleine's history. You know that her family had to flee both the Nazis and Stalin during and after the Second World War. Her father was a very distinguished Czech diplomat, and they were refugees to this country, and they settled in Denver, Colorado, and Madeleine spent her teenage years right here in Colorado, in Denver. Condi's family had to live in the segregated South in Birmingham, Alabama during the civil rights struggle of the early and mid-1960s. They moved to Denver, Colorado, where her dad taught at the University of Denver, the same university, and she spent her teenage years here. Not coincidentally, they both saw as young women education as the path to success in our society. They both became professors. Madeleine still teaches at Georgetown University, Condi at Stanford University, in California. They both had their first significant professional foreign policy experience as White House staffers, Madeleine in the Carter administration, Condi in the administration of President George H.W. Bush, Bush 43, and they both became, of course, Secretaries of State. They had to deal, as Secretary of State, with major challenges. During Madeleine's time, she was instrumental in the very positive decision for the United States to intervene successfully to end the civil wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. She had to deal with differences between India and Pakistan. She had to deal with a lot of the transnational issues that emerged, HIV, AIDS, and poverty. Condi, as Secretary of State, as National Security Advisor, was in the White House on September 11th, 2001. And she was part of the team working for President Bush that led the fight against al-Qaeda and, of course, made the big decisions about Iraq and Afghanistan. She was the architect of our successful opening to India over the last 5 years. So you have two of the most distinguished women and leaders imaginable. But there's one more thing that I wanted to tell you. They are supremely nice human beings. And I know that because I worked for both of them. And when you're, I think a lot of you know, whether you're in business or government, when you're working together 18 hours a day, it matters if your boss is intelligent, creative, dynamic. It really matters if you like them. And they were beloved Secretaries of State. Now, there's one more thing I need to tell you. There is a person, one person, and many of you might not know this story, who was the mentor for both of these women, who provided the inspiration that I suppose, what they'll tell us, led them to this career in foreign policy and international affairs. And I think it's only right that the first question should go to Madeleine. Madeleine, tell us about that person.
Well, I think some of you have heard the story, but let me say, my father, as Nick said, but before I begin this, Nick, you are a nice person, and it was very nice to have you working for both of us. My father did come and teach at the University of Denver. He ultimately became dean of the Graduate School of International Studies, and he died in 1977, and by then he was a pretty big deal. And there were flowers and tributes and various things, and among all the things was a ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with a variety of leaves and flowers in it. And I said to my mother, "Where did this come from?" And she said, "It's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice." And what happened was that, and Condi can tell her side of this, she was a music major. She took international relations. I don't know whether you had to, Condi, for distribution or whatever. But my father persuaded her to become an international relations major. She did her master's at Notre Dame and was working on her PhD with my father when he died. And so this wonderful young woman from Alabama, music major, was writing a dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. In 1987, when I was working for my long string of losing Democratic presidential candidates, at that stage I was working for Michael Dukakis. Joe, you remember that. And my job was to get foreign policy experts. So I thought, perfect. I didn't know Dr. Rice, but I figured Soviet expert, woman, teaches at Stanford, perfect. So I called her up and I said, you know, Condi, we don't know each other, but I am looking for foreign policy experts for Michael Dukakis, and I'd just love it if you would be part of our group. And she said, Madeleine, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father.
Well, I get equal time to tell my side of this story. Indeed, I was a music major. When I entered college, I played piano from age 3. I was going to be a great concert pianist. Nick, it never occurred to me to be Secretary of State. I wanted to be playing over there in the tent as a music major. And I think some of you have heard the story. I actually came here to the Aspen Music Festival School as a 17-year-old music major. I met 12-year-olds who could play from sight what it had taken me all year to learn. Decided that I was about to end up teaching 13-year-olds to murder Beethoven, or maybe playing piano bar someplace, or playing at Nordstrom, and decided to find another path. And I took a bunch of different courses. I took a course first in English literature. That was going to be my major. I hated it. Then I was going to do state and local government, but my project was to interview the city water manager of Denver, the single most boring man that I've ever met to this day. And I thought, that's not it. And I wandered into a class in international politics taught by this man named Joseph Corbell. And all of a sudden, this world opened up to me of diplomacy and the Soviet Union. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I had found my passion. And Madeleine, the wonderful thing about your father was that he was intellectually rigorous, and he was just incredibly creative. But he was also, Nick, to your point, he was someone who nurtured people. And I felt that I'd not only found a professor, I'd found a kind of intellectual father. And so, Madeleine, it wasn't really much fun to tell you that I couldn't work with you on the Dukakis campaign, but we've maintained a great relationship. And as a matter of fact, the two of us will be in Denver in a few weeks because the Joseph Corbell School, as it is now called, will have an anniversary celebration, and I'm very much looking forward to that. So that's the story. I do have to say, Nick, to you too, and I'm sure Madeleine and many who know Nick would agree, not only were you fun to work with, but I've known few more capable public servants who cared deeply about what they were doing, but also who could get it done. And it was a joy to work with you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Good. So, this session is entitled Making History and Mapping the Future. So let's ask questions in two parts. Let's look back a little bit over the last 15 or 20 years, the time when you were both leaders in foreign policy, still are, and then we'll look ahead. Let's look back first. You were the first two female secretaries of state. Condi was the first female national security advisor. That wasn't an issue inside the United States, certainly not for those of us who work for you, but it might have been an issue overseas. Could you share some stories with us?
Well, first of all, let me say my youngest granddaughter, who turned 7 last year, said to her mother, my daughter, "So what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie having been Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State." Which is quite an amazing. But let me say this. What happened was when my name came up on a short list, there were stories automatically that said that leaders in foreign countries would not deal with a woman Secretary of State, and especially with Arab countries. And what happened, I was at that stage ambassador to the United Nations, and the Arab ambassadors there got together and said, "We've had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. This will not be a problem." Frankly, I had more problems with the men in our own government, except for you. And it was not a
Do you want to name names?
No. But what was interesting was that and I don't know, Condi, I think you probably felt the same way. I wanted to, first of all, it had not occurred to me to be Secretary of State. You said it was it never would have, now we all wear pants, but at the time I'd never seen a Secretary of State in a skirt, so it wasn't going to happen. But what did happen, I wanted, if I were to be Secretary of State, I would want to be selected because I would be the best, not because I was a woman. And so even though there were attempts to have all kinds of women's groups pressure, I deliberately did not want that. But what happened was somebody in the White House made a terminal mistake and said, yes, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. And that made a lot of people really crazy. I would not have been Secretary of State if it hadn't been for Hillary Clinton. And that's just a statement of fact, which President Clinton says. And what she said was, why wouldn't you have Madeleine as Secretary of State? She states your views clearly, and besides, it would make your mother very happy. So that is what happened. But it was not simple. And it was not at all simple in terms of being taken seriously by the men in the government who actually thought they should be Secretary of State. And so it was not a simple issue. And when Condi was named as National Security Advisor, remember, Condi, I invited you over to,
Yes.
was during the
State Department,
transition,
right?
to come to the State Department, and we talked about what your life would be like.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, Madeleine had broken a lot of ground by the time I was Secretary of State. Madeleine says her granddaughter says only girls are Secretary of State. It is remarkable that the chief diplomat of the most powerful country in the world. When Hillary finishes her time as secretary, we will not have had a white male Secretary of State for 16 years. And that's really rather remarkable when you think about it. And as to foreign leaders, first of all, they really don't want to make you angry as Secretary of State by treating you badly because of your gender. They really don't. They know you're Secretary of State of the United States, and that transcends. In the Middle East, I occasionally found it actually to be an advantage. I will tell you two stories in that way. First of all, there are some very powerful women in the Middle East, largely the matriarchs of these very important families in the Middle East, who will sometimes talk to women when they won't talk to men. They simply have religious or cultural views that they can't be a part of the sort of normal diplomatic process, but they will occasionally invite you for tea, and you learn a great deal in those meetings. Secondly, it was always very heartening for me when at the end of a meeting with some very, very conservative, usually Shia cleric who could not shake hands with me because I was a woman, he would say, but can you just wait a minute here? I'd like you to meet my 13-year-old granddaughter. And out would come some little covered girl who would say, oh, I've seen you on television. I want to be a foreign minister too. And you would think this man, with all of his prejudices, still somehow he sees something better for his granddaughter, and maybe that's a hopeful sign. And so I often found it to be an advantage. And you know, we're going to talk about this later, I know, but in terms of you know, the men in the administration or in Washington, yes, I'm sure that there are those views. But you know how Washington is. It's a blood sport anyway in politics, and you just better get in there and be part of it. We used to say, you know, if you don't like the nature of the politics in Washington, maybe you shouldn't go. Or our other favorite line was, welcome to the NFL.
I have to ask, do you really want to be NFL commissioner?
Well, I told Roger Goodell, who I now consider a good friend, and by the way, a very good commissioner of the NFL, when I spoke for the owners some time ago, I said, you know, Roger, when I was tussling with the Russians and the Iranians and the Middle East every day, your job looked pretty good. But now from Northern California, your job doesn't look so good anymore. And so I think I'll pass.
Okay, we're going to get to some serious issues, but there's one more thing we have to discuss. The three of us were with Walter in his office talking about this program. We remembered that there's this tradition every summer of American Secretary of State traveling out to Southeast Asia for the ASEAN meetings, the Association of Southeast Asian States. Very serious business, talking about issues in Asia. But in the evening, there's a musical program. Each foreign minister must get up on stage and perform a musical number. I can tell you, as a career diplomat, that Madeleine's predecessors had not gotten up on the stage. Madeleine did, as did Condi. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, things you never expect to have to do when you're Secretary of State. So I get this notification saying you do know that you are going to have to put on a skit. And I said, you must be out of your minds. And they did say, and previous secretaries have done a really bad job. So the State Department gave me lyrics to Mary Had a Little Lamb. And I said, we are not doing this. Nick was on the trip, and on the trip, what had happened was I wasn't sure I was going to the ASEAN meeting because they had just invited Burma, and we didn't believe that Burma should be part of it. So we then made up a song to Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. It was Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. And I got dressed up as Madonna. And I had a great backup team. And I sang Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. They were totally blown away. And that particular year, Foreign Minister Primakov had some stupid skit about the Black Sea Fleet. And so we then decided that the following year we would break ground by doing a duet together. So on the margins of important meetings about Iraqi sanctions or the Balkans, we decided that we would do our version of the East-West story, the West Side Story, and we called it the East-West Story. And we practiced, and we made up the words, and the night before the whole thing, the Russians brought vodka and caviar, and we practiced in General MacArthur's suite in Manila. And we had a rumble at the beginning. Kurt Campbell, your predecessor, was part of that. And I came out on the stage singing, "The most beautiful sound I ever heard, Yevgeny, Yevgeny." And then he came out singing, "Madeleine Albright, Madeleine Albright, I just met a girl called Madeleine Albright." And I am the centerfold in his book.
You can't top that.
No. As a matter of fact, as you can well understand, by the time it was time for me to do my ASEAN presentation, I decided that Madeleine had retired the book on how to do an ASEAN presentation, so I played Brahms.
Okay, now to the serious stuff. You both had significant achievements as Secretary of State. Both Clinton and Bush administrations did. Where did you make your mark? What are you most proud of as Secretary?
Well, Walter, I think, and you mentioned this a little bit, there is no question in my mind that the thing that I'm proudest of is what we did in the Balkans. I was at the United Nations when I thought we were very slow in terms of doing what we needed to on Bosnia. And life is very peculiar in terms of accidents. My father had been ambassador to Yugoslavia, so this is part of the world that I identified with and fully understood. And so as I saw what was going on in Kosovo, I felt that we needed to do something about it as people were being ethnically cleansed for who they were, not anything that they were doing. And the reason it's interesting, I think, to those of you that are professors or follow the national security system, it was very rewarding because it was interesting within the government itself. Fortunately, President Clinton agreed with me, but since the State Department has no airplanes, it was very important to get the Pentagon on board. And so it was interesting to work it within the bureaucratic system and figure out how to do it properly. And then there was the international part. And I invented something which sounds crazy, but it was the diplomatic conference call. And every day I called the major foreign ministers of NATO in order to plan what we were going to do. We had kind of diplomacy in the support of the use of force, then the use of force, then again diplomacy. And I feel very good about what happened in Kosovo. I feel especially, that they do like me there. There's a whole generation of little girls whose first name is Madeleine. But I feel particularly good because in the last 2 weeks it has been decided that it is appropriate that Kosovo be an independent country. So it's something that I felt very strongly about. It was interesting to work as an issue both domestically and internationally. So I do feel good about that.
And hindsight's 2020. There's a flip side to every coin. I served in the same administration. What would be the thing that you could, if you could redo an issue, what would it be? Would it be Rwanda and the failure to intervene quickly in 1994, or is it another issue?
Well, I was ambassador during the time of Rwanda, and I wish we could redo that. And I think it's very important for people to understand the circumstances of it. One of the things I find very hard about our 2020 hindsight and the way we operate, and those of us that have been decision makers, I think you have to figure out what we knew at the time and not in hindsight. There's a lot of stuff now on Rwanda that has come out later, but I can just assure you, well, you were there, is that basically there was nothing in our intelligence that was really definitive in terms of what was going on in Rwanda. And I was an instructed ambassador at the time. I got instructions that we could not, in fact, support more UN troops. It was time I got up and I screamed. I didn't like my instructions. I called Washington. I was told to stick with them. But I really wish that we had argued more. The ironic part is that a few years ago, we were commemorating the 10th anniversary of Rwanda. Hotel Rwanda came out, and I called Rwanda really volcanic genocide. It happened very quickly after the plane of the president, who was a Hutu, went down. Meanwhile, in Sudan, we were watching rolling genocide, and we still weren't able to do anything about it. So I think that if I had something to redo, it would be that particular issue. Another one that I would redo is our Camp David, because I wish that we had...
The Israeli-Palestinian discussions of August 2000.
And we've, all of us, gone over it over and over again in our minds. And I think the mistake we made was allowing to be told that we couldn't really, Dennis Ross's term always was to try to condition the moderate Arabs. We should have talked to them much more ahead of time, because Arafat had the right to make decisions about the size of the Palestinian state. He was the Palestinian leader. But we were asking him to make disposition of the holy places, of which he was not the sole keeper. The Saudis and other Muslims were involved in that. So that would be something that I wish we could redo.
Thank you. Condi.
Well, let me just start by saying that, as like Madeleine, as a student of international history, some of what went right and some of what went wrong will not be known for a long time. And I kept saying to people, you know, today's headlines and history's judgment are rarely the same. And I kept Secretaries of State's portraits near me that reminded me of that, including William Seward, when he bought Alaska, was excoriated for it, and it was called Seward's Icebox and Seward's Folly. And Sergei Ivanov, who was at the time the Russian defense minister, had been taken to Alaska, and he said, "Oh, Condi," he said, "Alaska is so beautiful." He said, "It reminds me of Russia." I said, "Sergei, it used to be Russia." And so the fact is, sometimes it takes a while before decisions and their effects can really be understood. But with that caveat, I would say that first and foremost, I am really pleased that we stood for the proposition that every man, woman, and child has the right to live in freedom. And I think that's something that Madeleine strongly believed as well. Now, I will be the first to admit that the people that I think we tried to help launch on that path, not because we started out to launch democracy in Afghanistan or Iraq, but because we saw security threats there. And then once having dealt with the security threat, felt that the United States had to have a view about the future of those countries. I recognize that we made a lot of mistakes. These were big, complex operations, and there are many things I would do differently. And it may well be that the Afghans and the Iraqis will not take the opportunity that has been given to them to become multi-ethnic democratic states. But I think they have a chance that they did not have in 2001, and I'm very proud of that. Secondly, I'm very proud of what we did in foreign assistance. We quadrupled foreign assistance to Africa. We doubled it worldwide. The President's Emergency AIDS Relief Program is perhaps the best known, but the Millennium Challenge Program, which challenged African and Latin American countries to have good governance and good leadership, and not to steal their people blind, in exchange for large assistance packages from the United States, $878 million for Tanzania, $500 million for Ghana. I think it was a conception of foreign assistance as a partnership between the donor and the recipient, where good governance became the criterion that will live on. And I'm very pleased that we were able to significantly increase American foreign assistance in a way that I think will help in the development of the world. And finally, we were today talking about India, and you mentioned, I think that helping to open new ground for some of the big multi-ethnic democracies like India and Brazil to understand that the United States believes that they have a rightful place in global leadership is something that, again, will take time to mature, but I'm glad we started the process.
And our friend Taran Das of Aspen, India, president, is here with us. We just spent 2 days talking under Brent and Joe's leadership with the Indian delegation about the future of the U.S.-India relationship. I would also say, Condi, a singular, little recognized, but singular success of the Bush administration, you and President Bush, is stable, good relations with the great powers of the world.
And with China, you know, it's interesting. It was once thought you couldn't have simultaneously good relations with China, India, Japan, Pakistan. I think we did manage to have good relations with all. But again, these are things, I think Madeleine would agree with this, you start things sometimes. You don't see them to fruition. That's just the nature of foreign policy. You and I, Nick, were fortunate to be in the White House when a great historical epoch came to an end. The Cold War ended, so-called on our watch, but we had to recognize that we were actually harvesting good decisions that had been taken in 1946 and 47 and 48 and 49 and 1950, when nobody would have dreamed that you were going to see the peaceful collapse of communist power in Eastern Europe, the unification of Germany fully on Western terms, and the hammer and sickle would come down from the Kremlin one day, the Soviet Union never mind. And so we need to be careful as policymakers to recognize that it's sometimes hubris to think that you are affecting international politics because of what gets completed on your watch. Very often, you are completing the work that others did when the circumstances and the prospects looked a lot bleaker.
I have to say, as I was thinking about what we were going to talk about, this continuity aspect, no Secretary of State comes in and has a clean slate. And actually, we belong to a very special club. There are not a lot of former Secretaries of State. And the only thing I have against you is that you are now the youngest. Because I was a month younger than Colin Powell. But I do think that we begin to recognize what it means to sit in that chair and understand that you do have something to do with deploying the power of the greatest country in the world and how you deal with it and the continuity. And I was specifically thinking when we came in for the first term, it was to deal with what you had left, and Brent, in terms of the reunification of Germany, and then how we moved forward on putting Europe back together. Absolutely. And what was happening in the Balkans was the missing piece. Exactly. And then we did the NATO expansion, and a series of issues that really are there that need to be taken up by the chief diplomat of the country in very close collaboration with the president. But that continuity part, now sometimes there's a discontinuity, and we can talk about those, and we probably should, because there's certain things that got done somewhat differently than if other people had stayed in. But the continuity, I think, is a truly, truly important part of this story. And we do all get together, the formers, in order to talk about what the responsibilities were at the time that we had them.
Yes. Nick, I have to say, though, what I would do differently. And look, there are a whole bunch of things I would do differently. But let me put one on the table that may surprise you a little bit from my perspective as Secretary of State. I am so sorry we didn't get comprehensive immigration reform. No, we had a chance. When you have a bill that George W. Bush, Teddy Kennedy, and John McCain all want, and you can't get it through the Congress, you realize the potential for the demagoguery about this particular issue. And I'm a great believer that the United States of America is a country of immigrants. It is both what has been a great deal of our energy and our ability to regenerate. It is also what has kept us from the sclerotic demographics of Europe and the tragic demographics of Russia. And if we don't get this issue right, then we are going to undermine one of the most important tenets of what has made the United States work. And we came to office, President Bush wanted to do comprehensive immigration reform. He had been the governor of Texas. I remember the first meeting with Vicente Fox was actually before the two of them were inaugurated. They'd both been elected. We met in Dallas, and they talked about the need for comprehensive immigration reform. And for a variety of reasons, we couldn't get it done, and I think it would have been a really important step had we been able to do so.
We're going to go to your questions in a minute, but I wanted to have the two secretaries look ahead a little bit at some of the key issues that America is going to face. And one of them is China. There is a bit of conventional wisdom these days in our country, but especially around the world, that the United States has lost its edge, that we're going to lose relative power in the world, and that maybe China not only is gaining on us, but will overtake us at some point in our lifetimes. I don't happen to buy that. I know Joe is writing a book that deals in part with this issue. He may want to speak about this in this session. But Madeleine, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think that we are looking at a very different world. I wrote a book called Memo to the President-elect. I didn't know for whom I was writing it. I did give it to Barack Obama ultimately, and I said with the audacity to hope that this book will be useful. But I laid out some umbrella issues, which I'll just say very quickly because they go to this point. One is how to deal with terrorism without creating more terrorists, how to deal with a broken nuclear nonproliferation system, how to deal with the growing gap between the rich and the poor, how to deal with energy, environment, food security, and how to have a really good reputation for democracy, and then now the financial crisis. So just listing them, makes you realize that no matter how powerful the United States is, we cannot deal with those issues alone. Therefore, I think that the next phase has to be one in which there are other powers that we recognize as having a global responsibility with us. I don't think it detracts from our power. I think it's a force multiplier. And the question is how we do it. So that, and for me, the Chinese issue is the following. I watched them when I was ambassador at the UN. You could barely get them to participate in any debate unless it was over internal matters. They didn't like what we were doing in Haiti because Taiwan was supporting them, but otherwise they really didn't engage. When slowly they began to have some interest, regionally, Condi, you got them on the six-party talks, and now the issue is how to make them take a larger responsibility, not to just kind of be free riders. And so the bottom line here is list the issues and recognize that U.S. power is the strongest in combination with others, and I don't see us as a declining power.
So you think, Madeleine, 50 years from today, given America's political and military and economic power, will still be in a community of great powers, probably the most significant?
Well, I believe, this is what I say. When I first got to the UN, because I'm a professor, I had to have a theoretical construct. So I saw four groups of countries. The first were countries that wanted to be part of an international system. We didn't all agree on everything, but did want to be a part of it. The second were the new countries that didn't have all the infrastructure to be part of the first group. The third group were those that we called rogues until we got more polite and started calling them states of concern. And then there were the basket cases. But the bottom line was to try to get everybody into the first group because that's where we were the strongest, where our value systems, and Condi, I agree with you, which is that I happen to think that we're all the same, and everybody, wherever they want to live in freedom and have the possibility of making choices about their own lives. And so an international system of which we are either the number one partner or the managing partner, the emphasis should be on the noun, not on the adjective, allows us to be in that particular position.
I would agree, and I don't know what to predict 50 years from now, but I will put it this way. I do not see a challenger to the particular confluence of assets the United States has in terms of a view of how the world ought to turn out, democracy, economic power, political power, military power. I don't see a real challenger to that, including China, which I think we tend to, as much as China has done, and it is remarkable, we tend to overstate the kind of straight line projection for China going forward. The Chinese leadership knows that it has an awful lot of work to do at home. This is still a very poor country in terms of the number of poor people in it. It's a country that's experiencing a lot of strain from the rapid economic and social development that is taking place there within a pretty rigid political system. Ask yourselves the following. Can a country that is so terrified of the internet that it is hacking into people's servers in order to find that last human rights advocate lead the knowledge-based revolution that is at the front edge of economic development? And I think you will say probably not. So I don't see China as an overall competitor for American, whatever you wish to call it, influence. Some people would say dominance. What I do see is a United States gone bad that could fail to secure its place in the international system. I mentioned immigration. Our miserable K-12 education system, particularly for poor kids, is a real threat to us in terms of our own security. And I think that, and Americans are frankly getting a bit tired, and I take some responsibility for that. But whether you want to call us a special nation, a unique nation, an indispensable nation, Americans have to believe that we're special, or we will not take on the responsibilities of leadership. We are not just any other country. And I think if we tell Americans we're just any other country, we're rightly going to say, then why do we bear the burdens and responsibilities that others will not? And while I would love to see other countries step up to those responsibilities, I'm sure Madeleine has experienced what I had, which is that you're always disappointed by how much most others are willing to do, and you're always a bit taken aback when people come to you and say, without the United States, this will not happen. And so the question is, can we arrange ourselves in a way and play to our strengths and reinforce our strengths? There is a lot of anxiety among Americans these days, and I think these are existential questions about whether the truths that we've always held, that my children are going to do better than I did, that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. All of those fundamental truths that hold us together as Americans, that's what people are worried about. And so if we don't refocus on our internal strengths, I think we could have a problem in being the kind of influential leader in the international system, not because of another power, but because of our own internal difficulties.
Let me say, it's interesting because the indispensable nation business, what happened was actually President Clinton said it first, but I said it so much it became identified with me. And the reason that I said it, or we both said it, was, and it's the post-Cold War period, that I was afraid that after, quote, the end of the Cold War, that Americans, if you all remember, we talked about the peace dividend and a number of different things, that people would become disinterested in America playing a leading role. Now, I've talked a little bit about my background. For me, America is an exceptional nation. When an emigre professor can train 2 secretaries of state, it's a pretty exceptional nation. The problem is that I think we're exceptional. We can't ask that exceptions be made for us. And for me, what is important is that the U.S. really is part of an international system where there is a recognition of the way that it is appropriate to act and what role we play. But I believe that we do need to be engaged internationally. And if the U.S. isn't, then nothing happens. We've both sat at tables enough to say, well, you just said it, we have to really do it. But I also agree with you about what's happening internally. And so Americans need to feel that we can deal with the issues of our education and immigration and employment and the financial issues. And there never has been, as far as I'm concerned, a real division between domestic and foreign policy. They go together.
Okay, one last question before we go to the audience. We're a global power. We have to operate in every corner of the world, but there's a space in the world extending from the Middle East to South Asia, which is where most of our vital interests are now in play, including the 2 wars. President Obama has taken office, I think, with the most forbidding and difficult foreign policy agenda of any president in my memory. And he has to deal with 2 wars, how to get out of one successfully, how to prosecute another successfully, a country, Iran, trying to break all rules and become a nuclear weapons power, the Israeli-Palestinian problem 62 years running. Choose, if you would, one of those, and what advice would you give to the president if he asked for it?
Well, look, President Obama, whom I respect a great deal and got to know when he was on Senate Foreign Relations, and I'm quite fond of him, doesn't really need my advice on these matters. As I've said, look, I believe very strongly that you give your successors a chance and that there's a certain decorum that is owed your successors. And so I've been very clear that I don't intend to criticize what the current administration is doing. I think that there is a fair amount of continuity in a lot of the issues that you mentioned, and I think we have to be a little bit careful. Yes, the list is really daunting, but if you were Harry Truman, it was really daunting. And so that says to me, America's gotten through this before, and America will get through it again. And one reason that I say that is that it's very easy to sit where you are and say, oh my goodness, it's all coming apart around me. And what you really need to do is to find the 2 or 3 things that you've got to do to unlock some sense of democratic stability in the system. And there are several. From my point of view, you obviously have to make Afghanistan work. You need to continue to pay attention to Iraq because they are central to this area that you talked about. But let me just say one word about the Israeli-Palestinian peace. It is absolutely the case that the Palestinians are not Hamas in Gaza, but in the West Bank under Salam Fayyad and Mahmoud Abbas are trying to build the institutions and the basis for a democratic Palestinian state. And they're having some success. Growth is up in the West Bank. Stability is up in the West Bank. The security forces are better in the West Bank than at any other time. And that was deliberate. People worked very hard. Walter worked very hard on a Palestinian-American partnership that helped to bring American civil society and the business community to that fight. So there is something to work with in the Palestinian state. But they need to be in direct negotiations, and they need to be in direct negotiations soon. And when you look at what was on the table for Abbas from Ehud Olmert, who, to be fair, got in political trouble and therefore perhaps couldn't have delivered, everybody knows what this deal looks like. And while I do not subscribe to the view that the creation of a Palestinian state will be the holy grail for a stable Middle East, I do think it is one of the 2 or 3 most important pillars of a stable Middle East. And so my advice to anyone trying to deal with this issue is get them to the table, tell them both that time is not on their sides, and frankly, the next time there's a deal, tell the Palestinians to take it.
Well, I would agree with that as a major issue, and I would also hope that there would be direct talks. I think that, however, well, first of all, I think I was a pretty good former Secretary of State when the opposition was in office. It's a little harder when your own party is, and when the current Secretary of State is one of my best friends. So, but I think we need to look at the Afghanistan issue, and we will in the next couple of days in the Aspen Strategy Group, on any number of aspects. And some it's Afghanistan itself, but it is also the region. And if one were to do a lottery in the State Department on any given day, what's the most complicated place, I would pick Pakistan. Pakistan has everything that gives you an international migraine. It has nuclear weapons, terrorism, poverty, extremism, a weak government, and they're in a bad location. So I think that what needs to be looked at is the whole region together. And I would believe that there needs to be more work done on regional diplomacy, on regional assistance, and a way to deal with the whole area. The Middle East stuff is there every day, and frankly, it is the day-to-day job that any diplomat has. But I think that we need to focus a lot more on that area, and I'm very glad that it is the subject of the Aspen Strategy Group discussions this time.
We're going to go to questions. As we do, I was remiss in not recognizing our chairman of the Aspen Institute, Bob Steele, who's here with us. So, Bob, thank you. And Congresswoman Jane Harman of California, and Sidney Harman, who had a birthday yesterday. Congratulations. And our friends Ann and Ton Korologos, who hosted the Aspen India Dialogue 2 nights ago. Thank you so much for your hospitality. So the only request I have, you'll see there are individuals with microphones, is that you just identify yourself by name, and then you'd ask a question. Just make sure there's a question mark attached to the end of that statement. And Professor Skip Gates, Harvard University. Skip, please. Yes, you do. You have it right there.
Great. This is fantastic. Thank you. Aren't they great? Just amazing. I've just come back from Cuba. I'm making a new documentary series for PBS and BBC called Black in Latin America. So since May 8th, I've filmed in Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Haiti, Cuba, and I'll go to the DR in September. Richard Nixon will be remembered for many things, but most positively, perhaps, for opening up China. What should our policy toward Cuba be? And should President Obama consider opening it up?
Well, let me say that at the beginning of President Clinton's term, I can tell you that we were looking at ways to normalize relations with Cuba. We talked about it a lot. We were working on it. And then there was the Brothers to the rescue, and the Cuban pilots shot down unarmed American planes, and the embargo became, which had been an executive act, became a law, Helms-Burton. And it really changed things. It did make my reputation because I was able to say what had happened was that I had the transcript of what the Cuban pilots were saying to each other as they were chasing the American planes, and they actually did say, we have cojones, they don't have cojones, and when they hit them, they said, we got their cojones, and I said, it's not cojones, it's cowardice. Now Sarah Palin's picked that up. But the bottom line is it did change the fact that there was a law that makes it very difficult, and the law has to be changed. I studied changes in communist systems. I think that there is a way that openness helps in terms of the ability of people to talk to each other, and I think the time has come to really push for more democracy action in Cuba. And, you know, I don't make a lot of predictions in life, but Castro will die. And so I think that there are a variety of opportunities here. And I think the Obama administration has taken the right approach in terms of loosening up some of the Bush administration aspects of no travel, no remittances. And that was something that we did allow because we thought that it created democratic space for those that wanted some kind of independent action.
I think the question isn't really, do you want to open up to Cuba? You want to open up to, anyway, it's on what terms do you want to open up to Cuba? And when I would go to the Organization of American States, as Madeleine would, it was very striking that the only country unable to take its chair at the Organization of American States was Cuba, because it did not have a democratically elected president. Even Hugo Chavez, with all of his charms, is an elected president. And in the 21st century, that in our hemisphere, there is talk of the transfer of power from Fidel Castro to his brother is, I think, criminal. And so the question is, what are you going to say about the future of Cuba and its people when Fidel Castro dies? And he will, I agree with Madeleine, die. And I do not believe that the United States can be in a position of giving any signal that the transfer of power from Fidel to Raul is acceptable to us. A democratic process has got to be put in place. Now, to be sure, I don't mean that the week after Fidel dies, you have elections in Cuba. As you know, Skip, you were just said, Cuba would not be ready. There's no civil society to speak of. There are no parties. It would take time. But you know, we had a transition to democratic elections in Liberia that took 2 years because Charles Taylor had so wrecked the infrastructure of the country that the UN oversaw a 2-year transitional process to democratic elections, and they now are set on a very good course. I think there's another good reason to talk about the terms on which we would open to Cuba, and that is that I believe that those who believe that Raul Castro can assume the mantle of his brother peacefully may be mistaken. He has been the, not to put too fine a point on it, he's been the muscle of the Castro brothers. He's got many, many enemies, including in the military. And the idea that one day Fidel Castro is going to die and Raul is going to peacefully take power, I don't think so. And so what I've said to the Europeans in particular, I said to the Europeans when I was secretary, many of whom have exactly those relations with Cuba, have opened up to Cuba, hasn't managed, by the way, to democratize Cuba since they've opened up to Cuba. But I've said to them, you know, you are responsible, you're in a responsible position to say that Cuba needs to have a democratic process of transition if you want to see a stable Cuba. And since Cuba is in our hemisphere, I want to see a stable Cuba. I happen to believe that a stable Cuba will not emerge from the transfer of power from Fidel to Raul.
Hi, thank you. I'm Congresswoman Betsy Markey from the eastern part of Colorado, the flat part of Colorado. It's wonderful to be here in Aspen. You touched a little bit about Iran, and we have taken steps just recently for additional sanctions against Iran. But can you talk a little bit about what you think will be the next steps that we need to take in dealing with what will very likely be an Iran with nuclear weapons?
Well, I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And the course that I teach at Georgetown is called the National Security Toolbox. And the interesting part is, even though we had these great jobs, when you look into the toolbox, there's not a lot in there. And so you have diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. You have the economic tools of incentives and trade and aid, or disincentives like embargoes and boycotts. And then you have the threat of the use of force and the use of force, and intelligence and law enforcement. That's it. So as far as Iran is concerned, we have been trying, we are the diplomatic aspect of it in terms of trying to talk to them at various periods. When we were in office, there was a moment after President Khatami had come into office where we tried to have diplomatic discussions with them, kind of a diplomatic ballet. We are now into the economic tools of the sanctions that I think the fourth round of sanctions that have just been put in are much stronger, and then there are the unilateral ones that Congress has put in. Now, what is interesting is in the last couple of days, President Obama has indicated that he would be willing to go back to some kind of talks, feeling, in fact, I believe, that maybe there's an aspect of the sanctions working because the Iranians are sending some kind of signals. The other part, though, that the administration, various officials have said is you never take any option off the table. I think we learned that. You just never do it when you are a decision maker. And so Admiral Mullen has made clear that the military, and we know this also, the military has contingency plans for everything. And so they are there. But I happen to think that President Obama now has an interesting way of having those two tools of the economic sticks, the sanctions, and then saying again, maybe this is a time that there is a nuclear deal of some kind through diplomatic discussion. So it's that playing of the tools, but not taking options off the table.
Yeah, Nick very capably managed for me the two-track approach that I think has maintained, has been the center of U.S. policy, which is, on the one hand, you offer that there is always a path toward negotiation. On the other hand, if the Iranians are not playing, then you try and get sanctions. And we had 3 rounds. There's been a 4th. I do think the Iranians are feeling the pinch some because this is not a very strong economy to begin with, thanks in large part to Ahmadinejad's very bad economic policies. This is an economy under a lot of strain, and there's a lot more that you can do to put it under greater strain. I do think there's one other element, and that is what happened a year ago in June in the streets of Tehran does change the equation. I am not suggesting that the Iranian regime is going to come down tomorrow, but any sense of legitimacy for that regime is gone. I thought that when Hillary Clinton said that it's really now just a dictatorship, military dictatorship, she was absolutely right. The clerics are at each other's throats. Watch out when the children of the revolution suddenly start to be consumed by the revolution, and you start to have the nephew of Mousavi killed, and you start to have the grandson of this or that cleric put in jail. This is a revolution that has turned on itself, and it is doing what revolutions do when they are coming to their end. It's using brute force to try and put off the inevitable. Now, I don't know if it's a year from now or 5 years from now or 7 years from now, but I think the Iranian regime is probably done. And so the question is, what is the timeline between what the Iranians are trying to do in seeking a nuclear capability, and I say capability, not weapon, because even an inchoate or inherent capability is a problem for the region if it looks as if Iran is moving towards something that is weaponizable. The very fact that we talk about what Israel might do shows you the instabilities of a nuclear Iran. I think everybody saw what the UAE ambassador said about Iran. If you talk to the Arabs, you will hear much, much stronger views in that general direction. And so it's a bit of a timeline question, you know, what's happening in Iran domestically and what's happening in Iran internationally. I have never had a view that it's a problem to talk to people. That seems to me to be a tactical question. Do you talk to them or not? But I do know that when I talk to an adversary, I want to have the biggest stick at my side possible. When people say we talked to the Soviet Union, we did. But with NATO in place, with COCOM sanctions on the Soviet Union that made it impossible for the Soviet Union to get the kind of technological capabilities to grow its economy. We had a pretty tough containment policy toward the Soviet Union at the same time that we talked to them. And so I've often thought that the question of do you talk to them is a little bit misplaced. That's a tactic. Create the conditions in which Iran doesn't have very good choices, and then I think you've got the possibility for diplomacy. And perhaps, given the pressures on their economy, given their internal pressures, perhaps that time is coming. But I would be sure that I had a very big stick at my side when I go to that table.
And if you both permit me one comment, Congresswoman, there are two great ironies at work here dealing with Iran. The first is that consistent public opinion polls show that the most pro-American people in the Middle East are the Iranian people. And the second is, since the Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution in 1978-79, we have not managed to have, a consistent, sustained conversation between all the governments from Jimmy Carter to President Obama, because they have not wanted that conversation. And that's one of the great tragedies of this particular question.
And they missed the signal in 1998. It's an interesting story.
And ours.
And with you.
I should just mention, too, some 70% of the Iranian population is also under the age of 30. And so this is something to keep in mind when you think about Iran.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Herbert Rosenfeld, and I'm a visiting scholar at Harvard. Two-part question. Since Korea, we have been unsuccessful in the agenda that we've tried to carry out. North Korea, as well as Vietnam. Now we have the situation in the Middle East. What is the underlying agenda for us to submit 100,000 boys then and 5,000 boys now who have died in either Iraq or now 3,000 in Afghanistan? What is the underlying purpose of the U.S. government to be there? And by the way, our stick is no longer firm. It's a bamboo. We're economically under the thumb of China.
Yeah, let me take the last part of that. Economically under the thumb of China. I don't think that's how the Chinese see it. First of all, if the Chinese are going to continue to export to growth, they don't have that many markets to which to export. Secondly, with all of the talk about an alternative reserve currency, there isn't one. Third, even at the height of the global financial crisis, the Chinese did not do what some people thought that they would do and try to find a flight to safety for their capital, because there wasn't any other safety. And so I think we can overstate the degree to which the Chinese believe they have the economic upper hand. It's absolutely the case that they believe that they came through the global financial and economic crisis better than others did. And to a certain extent, that is true. But again, the Chinese leadership recognizes that it's riding a tiger. It is riding the most aggressive, the most radical economic and social transformation in human history with 1.3 billion people in a rigid political system. And when we look at whatever weaknesses the United States has, we have to recognize that the United States is still, when one looks at the dominant factors that lead to economic well-being, the United States still has the predominance of those. So I just don't think that if you're sitting in Beijing, yes, the Chinese will talk about how great their system came through all of this. But I don't think they're feeling quite as confident about how much they have the United States under their economic thumb. And I think that if you look at what they recently did on the currency, I mean, Undersecretary Bob Hormats is here, but what they just recently did on the currency, after lots of pounding from the international community about this, suddenly an internal debate broke out in China about the need to allow the currency to become more market-based. And you say, well, why would that be the case? Well, maybe the Chinese didn't really like being isolated on that issue. And that says something about the continuing capability of the United States to shape Chinese decisions?
On the other part of the question, first of all, I think that decision makers in foreign policy or any part of the national security policy, the responsibility is to worry about the national interests of the United States. That's the job. And the question is, how are the national interests of the American people affected by what is happening somewhere? One might have disagreements, and we probably do on some aspects of this, but let me say this. I believe that the national security interests of the United States require us to often take positions in terms of trying to deal with a terrorist threat or a nuclear threat or some way that the lives of Americans are affected, and the judgments are different in different places. So, for instance, someday I'm going to teach a course on the unintended consequences of foreign policy decisions, and one of the biggest ones is Afghanistan. That is a story. You can begin it way back, or during the Great Game, or you can begin it with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the reaction of the Carter administration, then the Reagan administration, and a variety of ways that Afghanistan has been a problem for us in terms of what it is spawning. And it is out of Afghanistan that the people that attacked us on 9/11, that's where they were based. I can understand that. We may have a completely different view on Iraq, and we maybe shouldn't go there. But the bottom line is that I do think that Afghanistan and what has been happening there continues to be a threat, and President Obama has made clear that what has to happen is for al-Qaeda, which has in many ways declared that they want to see the United States disappear or be struggling or whatever. I can understand that as a decision maker, you have to make some decisions about Afghanistan. But as I am not an isolationist, and I don't think that the people of the United States are completely secure if we say that we are not going to worry about what is happening in a particular country, whether they're creating nuclear weapons or whether they are spawning terrorists because they have terrible governments, or if in fact they pose some threat to our national security.
May I just add two things? First of all, let me just say a word about Iraq, and we may disagree, but let me just say a word about Iraq. Look, this was a country that was run by a homicidal maniac who had sought weapons of mass destruction and in fact used them against his own people and against his neighbors, and who had been sanctioned or had resolutions against him by the international community. Now, you can agree or disagree about the decision to go to war in Iraq. But the decision was made because the view was that you could not, in a Middle East that needed to change and was changing, continue to deal with the threat of Saddam Hussein, where the sanctions were breaking down and so forth. But that brings me to the question of, will Iraq ultimately use this opportunity to become the first true Arab democracy in the Middle East? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know for certain. But what we do know is that it is very hard to make judgments about big historical changes in snapshots, and that we have to be very careful about deciding that this or that has failed because it hasn't happened today. You said, sir, that nothing's gone much right since Korea. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed without a shot. Eastern Europe is free of communism. The countries in which, Madeleine, the country in which you were born, is free of Soviet power, of communism. Those countries are not just free of communism, they're members of NATO, for goodness sakes. And if you had told me in 1989, when I was lucky enough to be the Soviet specialist at the end of the Cold War in the White House, and frankly it doesn't get much better than that, but if you had told me at that time that in 2006, the President of the United States would attend a NATO summit in Latvia, a trend, by the way, that Madeleine, you and President Clinton, by the expansion of NATO, which many thought was a terrible historical mistake to expand NATO. And so we have to give history some time to unfold. But one thing that we know is that history hasn't generally unfolded very well if the United States has not been engaged and willing to make tough and sometimes sacrificial decisions in order to move things forward.
Marty Budd, both of our secretaries have talked about a common ground that they share, a belief that people all over the world want freedom and democracy. There was another professor who was not a Secretary of State, Sam Huntington, who suggested that these Western civilization ideas were in fact to be challenged over our next 50 or 100 years by a different civilization that didn't share those values. And I was wondering what each of you thought about Professor Huntington's observations about the potential for difficulty with Islamic states over the next 50 years.
Well, first of all, I really do believe that we are all the same. And I think that people everywhere want to be able to make decisions about their own lives, whether it begins about where they live and send their children to school or what language they speak. I think that's inherent. And there is a universal declaration where these are not American values, these are universal values. Now, I am a great believer in democracy, but you can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. It has to come bottom up, and there has to be a way that there is a possibility for people to understand the responsibilities of democracy, and we may be at different phases. So I'm prejudiced about this. I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, which is an organization that is part of the National Endowment for Democracy, something started by President Reagan. And there's an International Republican Institute, and we do not go around telling people what to do, but in fact providing the nuts and bolts for how to have a democratic government. And I don't believe that there is a basic contradiction between Islam and democracy. I think that we don't understand great parts of the Muslim culture and religion, and some of the issues are religious, some of them are cultural. But there also are very many elements of Islam that believes in democracy, so I wouldn't say that, nor do I think that there's such a thing as Asian values that don't allow for democracy. So I have to say that one of the things that is, we talked about continuity, but one of the things that does happen is each administration redefines a particular issue in a certain way. I don't agree with some of the ways that the Bush administration redefined it. I have to say, Condi, you were there. We had this great meeting where President Bush brought in the former Secretaries of State and Defense. I've never felt so young. I thought Melvin Laird didn't exist anymore. But President Bush came in and he said, I really need your support for democracy, and I really need your help. And as we were moving from the Roosevelt Room to the Oval Office, I said, Mr. President, I so agree with you about the need to support democracy. The only problem I have is that you act as though you invented democracy when actually I did. So, and he was great, and he laughed, and we had talked about what we did do was create a community of democracies where we were sharing best practices. So I had some problem with some of the definitions, and I have some problem with Sam Huntington's theories on this, but I do ultimately believe that democracy is the only form of government that responds to people's needs, but there isn't only American democracy.
I think that it's absolutely right. You can't impose democracy. I actually think you don't have to. You actually impose tyranny. You know, if you ask people, and I don't care how uneducated they are, do you want to be free from the knock of the secret police at night? Do you want to have a say in who's going to rule or govern you? Do you want to be able to say what you think, worship as you please? I think you'll get pretty resounding yes from even people who can't spell democracy because they're illiterate. So I think it is a universal value. And what's interesting, and Sam Huntington was one of the great political scientists and political minds of all time, but what's interesting about the proposition that there are certain either systems or people or cultures where the DNA is just not right for democracy is that that argument has fallen time and time again throughout history. So there was a time when Germans couldn't do democracy. There was a time when Latin Americans preferred caudillos and juntas. Now we don't think that of Latin America. There was a time when Africans were too tribal. And Skip will remember there was a time when black people were too childlike to care about that thing called the vote. So whenever we find ourselves saying about some other people or their culture, they really don't care about whether or not they are free to express their aspirations and to pursue them. I think we need to check our prejudices. Because what we're really saying is, well, you know, we want these great things, but, you know, those people out there, they only care about bread. I think it's a very patronizing way to think about the human race. And I would just add one final thing. You also have to be patient about it. The United States of America, of all places, ought to be patient about how long it takes to create democratic institutions that work for everybody. My father went to try to register to vote in 1952 in Birmingham, Alabama, and was told he had to take a poll test, count how many beans are in this jar, right? Now, it was not until 1965 that the United States of America got a Voting Rights Act that assured that the federal government would intervene on behalf of all American citizens and the right to vote. So who are we to say that just because it perhaps takes a little longer for the Iraqis to form their government or the Afghans to root out corruption, oh my goodness, how could they possibly be incapable of doing this? It takes a long time, but unless you get started, you are faced with the proposition that without democratic institutions, somebody's got to oppress somebody else. And that's also not stable. And if you want to see people who are really fearful of their populations, talk to authoritarians. They're terrified of their people. They don't know what they're going to do. They don't have feedback mechanisms. And oh, by the way, there is no peaceful way for them to be removed from power. And every single authoritarian, except maybe somebody that Madeleine met, but I didn't, Kim Jong-il, who I'm not sure would understand this, but almost every authoritarian fears the Ceausescu moment. Democratic leaders don't fear the Ceausescu moment. And so democracy is, in the long run, maybe not in the short term, but in the long run, not only morally right, but practically important to international stability.
Can I add one thing to that? You raise a professor, and one of the discussions that professors have, and sometimes practitioners, is what goes first, economic development or political development. And I have always thought that that was a phony argument. They go together. And what I have said now is democracy also has to deliver, because people want to vote and eat. And so it is important for economic development. You were saying rightly how much you all did for foreign assistance. We need to do that now. Secretary Clinton's gone with a very large foreign assistance package, because part of, as I mentioned, the big problem is the division between the rich and the poor. And so economic and political development have to go together. And there shouldn't be that kind of a false dichotomy.
And I think all of us support the budget that the State Department has put forward for foreign assistance. It needs to be kept up.
We have 5 minutes left. Let's try to get 2 questions and 2 answers. We'll begin with Ambassador Stuart Bernstein.
Stuart Bernstein, I admire all 3 of you so much. Had the honor and the pleasure to work with Condi and Nick. 2 superstars, if I must say so, and I predict someday Nick Burns will be a Secretary of State. Could you, as all 3 of you being in the inside, could you give us a picture of how it works? How did in a crisis, how do you make the decisions when you decided what to do in Iraq or in Kosovo? Thank you.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that what is important is the team that you've put together. And I think that as the president puts together a national security team, it is important to have people that respect each other and are compatible. What I think is also important is to have as president somebody that has the confidence to listen to a lot of different ideas in order to be able to get the best. Now, but ultimately, some of it is mano a mano. You have to go in and argue about your points. You have to be confident enough to go and in front of the others say, this is what I think needs to be done and this is how I do it. But I do think that there's a necessity for openness and respect, and ultimately a president who can understand and feel comfortable enough listening to the different ideas.
I agree completely with that, and you have to go in and you have to make your point and you have to argue, and it should never get personal, and I never experienced it getting personal. And you have to recognize that at some point you have to take a decision. You know, the difference between being out at Stanford or being at Georgetown is I can debate with my students, with my colleagues, with myself, these issues endlessly. As Secretary of State, or most certainly as President of the United States, you don't have that luxury. Eventually, you have to take a decision. And sometimes you take a decision without, almost always, you take a decision without perfect information, with less information than you would have liked, with assumptions that may not be quite right, but you have to take a decision. And so it is really important to have the open debate, and then you have to have a president who will take a decision.
And Stuart, I'd just say you need a Secretary of State who believes in her people. And the sad fact is we don't fund foreign affairs. I'm speaking as a former diplomat. There are more lawyers in the Pentagon than American diplomats. There are more members of the armed forces bands of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines than American diplomats. So Secretary Clinton has put forward a very aggressive budget, and I certainly hope the Congress is going to support that to strengthen our diplomacy. Thank you. To both of you. Time for one last question. Yes, way in the back. Yes.
Gustavo Cisneros from Venezuela. Dr. Albright, Dr. Rice, first, thank you so much for a master class that we will all remember. Very elegant. One question for two countries. What should the United States be doing policy-wise with a failed democracy like Venezuela and a failed state like Haiti?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I think that one of the issues that has come up, and Condi talked about OAS and the fact that Cuba was not able to take its seat. I think that when I was secretary, I used to travel around with maps that showed the movement from authoritarian governments to democratic governments, and the authoritarian were red and the democratic ones were green, and when we were in office there was only one little red island left. What has happened, I think, in Latin America, in some countries, and Venezuela is the prime example of this, is democracy did not deliver. And I went to Venezuela enough and saw that the place was run by a bunch of tired old men, and that there really was no reform that shared the view, shared what some of the reform projects were, and I can understand how Hugo Chavez got elected. The problem is that he now is operating off of a budget that doesn't work, an economy that has failed, and the question is to what extent the United States should pay as much attention to him as we do. I think that he gets a lot of fun out of the fact that we have made him kind of criminal number one. I don't think he was elected by a fair election. And so I do think that there has to be, again, a way of trying to get more reform in Latin America so that the kind of demagogic populist doesn't get more traction. On Haiti, I believe fully that there needs to be more international action. And we were up here, I guess, last summer, with Hernando de Soto, and we had done a plan together about how to, in fact, empower more poor people. And I'm now trying to figure out how to make sure that the idea of property rights, business rights, labor rights, and access to justice makes Haiti in some way an example where something like that could be done. I think there is a lot of international goodwill. The question is whether President Preval will go along with it or whether the next president will. But it is an opportunity for the international community to act together.
I would agree on Haiti. Haiti also seems to have the worst luck of almost any country in the world. I mean, they were just starting to come out of the situation there, and then you have, the natural disasters. It's a very sad place, and I do hope the international community will remain very much engaged. It is a good story that I think the Canadians have been very successful in training Haitian police. The Brazilians were very capable as the leaders of the peacekeeping forces there. So there are some good things that have happened in Haiti too. The HOPE Act that was passed in the Congress, giving preferences to Haitian goods. I think these are good pieces, but they don't put themselves together into a tapestry that would make Haiti successful in the future. And I agree with Madeleine about Hugo Chavez. We stopped calling his name, and it drove him crazy. We went down to Latin America, President Bush went down to Latin America, and by the time we had not called his name when we got to Uruguay, he was running all over Latin America saying, why won't they talk about me? Why won't they talk about me? We do have to recognize that while he is a bad example of what's happening in Latin America, there are awfully a lot of good examples in Latin America. This is a continent, or a continent, South America, and if you include Mexico in this, where most of the really important big countries have sustained democratic transitions, relatively strong economic, open economies, and pretty good relations with the United States. And you've had a couple of countries brought back from the edge, like Colombia, which in 2000 was a failed state. The Colombian military and police could not go into 30% of the country because of the FARC. Now, thanks to first Pastrana, but especially Uribe, Colombia is a place that is functioning again. You will all recognize the name Medellin. Medellin used to be synonymous with Pablo Escobar and trouble. And I was there. It's a lovely city with people playing, kids playing in the park. So there's some good stories in Latin America. And I think the key for the United States is to, while doing what you can about the bad boys, Hugo Chavez and his group, recognize that there is an awful lot of good to work with and talk about those people. Lula in Brazil. Here's a labor leader that a lot of people feared would take Brazil back to statist economic policies. Hasn't happened. When you look at Uribe in Colombia, when you look at Chile, which has made now a couple of democratic transitions. So there are some very good things, but here we also have to be sure that we are employing all of those tools in the toolbox. And I just have to make a commercial here. Pass Colombian free trade. This is a country that deserves to have the free trade agreement passed.
I agree, and I also think, Condi, that it's a good example. Plan Colombia is something that we started, and there was continuity on it. And I really think that we confuse the world a lot in terms of lack of continuity on some issues.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I had the great good fortune to work closely with Condi and Madeleine, and I can just speak for all of us in the Career Forward and Service. You were such great leaders. You supported us. I think you can all see from this remarkable conversation how lucky we were to have both of them as Secretary of State. Please join me in saluting them.